It's the Jeff Peterson episode. I'm going solo today. It's just me and the fish. There you go. I just fed them. They're getting active. They're ready for some Jeff Peterson content. The executive vice president of basketball operations, introduced as a Charlotte Hornet yesterday. He joined a bunch of different platforms. Let's try to consolidate as much of that content as we can right here on Locked On Hornets.
You are Locked On Hornets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
In a minute, cuz we live.
It's Locked On Hornets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Thanks for making us your first listen. We are free and available anywhere you get your podcast, and that includes YouTube as always. Yeah, I just introduced my fish. That's something I did without Doug's help. I go a little crazy without Doug as well. He'll be back with us on Monday, so I'm going solo to talk about Jeff Peterson and all the different platforms he joined, trying to figure out what was significant that he said and what was just a bunch of vague nothingness. We'll get to that in just a moment. Did want to tell you today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. You can download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's Game Time. Create an account, use code LOCKEDON for $20 off of your purchase. So let's get into some of the main takeaways from Jeff Peterson's introductory press conference, and then him joining the Kyle Bailey Show on WFNZ. He joined the Woj Pod. He was on Queen City News. He was on WCNC. So many different platforms. Jeff Peterson was a very busy man yesterday after the introductory presser. And so what I'm going to try to do, at least this is what I try to do today on Wes and Walker, and then in the morning and here in a little bit during the breaks. Like, I was trying to figure out what was important. And so I think I've got most of it. I don't know if there's anything else that I missed, but you can tell me at Walker Mail on Twitter if I did. Going through some of the main takeaways, I think the first one I go to is with the introductory presser, also including co-owners Rick Schnall and Gabe Plotkin. The first question is, are those owners going to let Jeff do his thing? He's the chief basketball decision maker, and that's what Gabe Plotkin and Rick Schnall were adamant about. As I look over to the notes here, they were adamant. They were making it very clear that he's the chief basketball decision maker, or a shot caller, as I like to call it. But he is the shot caller. That's what they were trying to be. That's what they were trying to relay to everyone. Everything will also be done in consultation with the owners, though. And I saw a bunch of people on my timeline get freaked out by that. And I get it, especially if you are a Carolina Panthers fan too, because David Tepper's entire tenure, he has been meddling in football operations. It's not anything that is a good recipe for success. So you're worried about Schnall and Plotkin being too involved in basketball operations, especially because, I don't know if y'all noticed this, at the podium, they were just seemingly taking credit for everything that happened at the deadline when we tried to figure out how much Mitch Kupchak had to do with acquiring the Oklahoma City players, Dallas, getting that first-round pick from Dallas and Miami in the Terry Rozier trade. We were like, okay, how involved were the owners there? Were they just telling Mitch Kupchak to be aggressive, or were they saying, no, you need to be aggressive, and these are the specific players that I'm asking for? It felt like at the podium, when they were asked about how they operated at the deadline, that it was them and only them operating at the trade deadline. Mitch Kupchak told you he was quite surprised by their knowledge of maybe even individual players. Yeah, man, it was them running the show all the way up and down. Every single moment of it was them. Poor Mitch can't get any credit, man. After not doing anything at the deadline for so long, finally does something. Pokemon stick. Come on. Do something, Mitch. Do something. Gabe Plotkin and Rick Schnall are the puppeteers, and Mitch Kupchak is just the puppet, although the puppet gets credit. I don't even know if Kupchak gets any credit whatsoever with the way they were acting. And so they told you, actually what was weird about what they were telling you at the deadline was that they didn't really intend to get better. They flat out told you they weren't trying to get better. We all know that, but it feels a little, say the quiet part out loudy when you say we weren't trying to get better, but at least they admitted it. We all knew that. You trade P.J. Washington, you trade Terry Rozier, you trade Gordon Hayward. Even with some of those guys being hurt, I didn't expect them to go on the run that they did post-deadline. It makes sense, just having capable bodies, but they told you we were just in asset collection mode. So anyways, they being very specifically Plotkin and Schnall. People were a little worried about every decision will be made in consultation with us, but he'll be the driving force on those basketball decisions. Yeah, that one's tough for me. Like, I don't know if I'm too worried about that. I saw some smart Hornets Twitter people tell you that, yeah, I saw that and I was a little worried. Are we talking about Michael Jordan again? Because that's what we're afraid of. We're afraid of David Tepper. We're afraid of Michael Jordan. We've seen it too much. To me, I operate in a space of not being naive enough to the point where none of these decisions are going to be made without some kind of sign-off from the owner, or at least the owner acknowledging it, at least bringing it to the owner's table, saying, hey, I got a trade here. I would like to make it, just letting you know this is what I want to do. And if the owner feels strongly enough about it, then he might veto it, and that's where you can have an issue. But it feels like, I don't know, 75, 80% of the franchises run this way? So I'm okay with every move or majority of the big ones. I don't know how much of the second round picks are going to be ran by Plotkin and Schnall to get their approval before they send it in. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm sure they'll be in the draft room. But to me, I'm willing to let this thing play out for at least a year or two before we really get too worried about how much meddling the owners are going to do in basketball ops. Because they really wanted to make maybe it was because they know it's trouble if we start to catch wind that Plotkin and Schnall are running this whole thing again, even with a different head decision maker going from Kupchak to Peterson. Maybe that's why they were so strong in their messaging. Even so, I understand all of that. And Peterson was telling you, something that he loves to talk about is that he's not smart enough to make all of these decisions by himself. So he tells you that he wants all the help he can get. He's getting that from ownership and also staffing. I wanted to go to one of the comments on the Woj pod as we're going to jump all around here with some of the comments. On the Woj pod, Adrian Wojnarowski asked him, what do you think are the two most important factors that you bring to this title as EVP with the Hornets organization? And he said two of the most important things that you need to focus on, or that it's important that you accomplish, have to have good staffing. He continues to go with, I'm not smart enough to make these decisions by myself. So he tells you staffing is important. And he also tells you discipline. And so I think those are interesting because, one, especially with the assistant coaches, the Hornets had a bad reputation that came out when Kenny Atkinson decided to go back to Golden State after agreeing initially to become the head coach. And then it came out that the Hornets don't really pay their assistant coaches all that much, that they wanted some of the assistants to stay on with Kenny Atkinson. Atkinson backs out. They still want those assistants to stay on with Steve Clifford as he makes a second go at this thing. And so it was weird, even if you can make some basketball sense out of keeping the assistants, to not pay them and to pay them towards the bottom in the NBA, that's where it gets tricky. So I'm hoping that with new ownership and Jeff Peterson acknowledging how important staffing is, no, he's not just talking about the coaching staff, but I'm hoping that those guys get compensated and that you get smart people, like legitimately not just yes man, which I don't think is true. I don't think that they're going to do that. I hope not. But I hope that you legitimately get a good cabinet to help you out in the decision-making process. I hope it's people that you're familiar with. I hope I hope there are smart people that you've worked with before, or at least respect enough to hear out their opinion. Because then if you just bring a whole bunch of the all-star dream team guys that they just want to be the head decision maker, that's where it can get a little tricky. But I like the good staffing and I like the discipline. And that leads me to another point that Jeff Peterson shared not only in the introductory presser, but also on the Woj pod. Peterson told you that he doesn't want to skip steps, which is a good sign. What's nice about what Woj did is he said, what do you mean by that? What are the steps that you think can be skipped every once in a while that leads the other franchises astray? And so when he was asked to specify that, Jeff told you, I think what happens is some teams will sacrifice long-term goals just so they could experience some success immediately. So you don't want to sacrifice those long-term goals just to succeed in the short term. Honestly, that's at least what Mitch Kupchak told you at the podium. He was very wary of that. You don't want to fall for this mirage that you're better than you actually are, and so you make a win-now move at the expense of winning long-term. Mitch Kupchak was all about it. In fact, he was too much about it to the point where he didn't do anything. We just have to find the nice medium, right? Like, you don't want to hire someone who is the exact opposite of Mitch Kupchak, who's making deals willy-nilly. It's a little Rich Cho-esque, if you will. You just want to correct it. You don't want to overcorrect it. And I'm hoping Jeff Peterson is that guy that can correct it to where I like that. If you're going to do anything, if you're going to lean one way or the other, I mean, I like that Mitch Kupchak leaned more so that you didn't want to sacrifice long-term success. You just never got out and did anything. He kept sitting on his hands. I don't think Peterson is a hand sitter. I do think that he'll correct a little bit without going at the opposite end of the spectrum to where we just experience no activity at the trade deadline after no activity at the trade deadline. Like, that's not what you're doing here, especially under new ownership. We have lots more sound to get to coming up next on the Locked On Hornets podcast. I'll continue to try to consolidate as much of these Jeff Peterson takeaways that I have, trying to give you a smorgasbord of all of the best food options that we got from all these different platforms. So even if you should go and read everybody's work and watch all of these clips, I'm going to try to help you make sense of it all. So instead, before we do that, I wanted to tell you about Nissan. This episode is brought to you by Nissan. As always, we appreciate their support. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. The Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and great escapes. They have class-exclusive Google built-in, which is your always updating assistant to call on for almost anything. And gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into a 12.3-inch high-definition touchscreen informant system. Man, this thing sounds like it's from the future. Go check it out. The 2024 Rogue is the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure. You also have the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder. It has room for up to 8 people. It has an expansive cargo capacity, an advanced available 4x4 capability too, with 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds towing. When adventure calls, the Pathfinder is there to answer. Whether it's the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada, you can take all three and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. That's NissanUSA.com. So as we continue to try to figure out exactly who Jeff Peterson is, I actually, speaking of that very question, that's what he was asked on the Kyle Bailey Show, which is a part of WFNZ. You can go check out that podcast and that show on WFNZ.com. But Kyle just asked Jeff who he is as a basketball player. What was his story? And so Jeff Peterson has a basketball background. If you didn't know already, this is someone that committed to Iowa out of Springfield, Missouri, goes to Iowa, transfers to Arkansas, and he tells you that his dream was to get to the NCAA tournament. And so he got his master's degree at Florida State. Yes, transferring twice and playing college ball for 3 different Power 5 D1 programs. But his goal was to get to the tournament, and they did. They actually won the ACC tournament that year that he went to Florida State and played under the North Carolina great Leonard Hamilton down there. So he's got a little bit of a background with a few different college basketball programs, and he loves the game. And I like that. And at the beginning of the Kyle Bailey Show pod, they talked about who he is as a guy. And also at the beginning of the Woj pod, this is something else I think is interesting. Woj asked Jeff about the city and how important basketball is to the Queen City. And look, a lot of this is placating to the public. We love this. The Hornets have done a lot of what they do is they try to force feed you this nostalgia. And I shouldn't even say force feed it because we eat it up, and I raise my hand high. I eat it as well too. But we need new memories. And because we don't have great new memories, we often focus on the good old days of Muggsy, LJ, and Zoe. And we always reference that trio. And that's exactly what Woj did with Jeff Peterson. I will say the fact that Woj acknowledges Charlotte as this sleeping giant-esque, like, I know that feels strong, But this is a city that is hungry for good basketball. We have not gone apathetic. That is not the case here. We care still. And I don't think there's any more evidence than what you can do when you point to 2 years ago when they were over 40 wins, they were over 500, and people wanted to see LaMelo ball. The fact that you got an all-star at like 20 years old, the fact that you won 40 games and competing to get to the play-in tournament, man, Spectrum Center, I don't know about rocking, but you had a lot more people in there than you do nowadays. And even so, you still get a decent turnout. Man, this fan base is hungry. They have real nostalgia, but they haven't gone away to these other franchises just because the Hornets haven't been good in quite some time. It feels like Woj realizes that. It feels like they're all, maybe they don't talk about it as much. It always feels like Charlotte is made as the joke. They're the butt of the joke in a passing way constantly. Zach Lowe, Bill Simmons, whoever, their constant passing insult is, it's not like we're talking about Charlotte. Oh, yeah, I'm not going to talk about Charlotte all that much. But now, Zach Lowe, I referenced earlier, he talked about this with Nekias Duncan, how Charlotte feels like a franchise that is comparable to Phoenix before Matt Ishbia bought the Phoenix Suns. While Phoenix might be a bigger market, it's still an area that players like to go to. It is somewhat of a free agent destination. This is an organization that does feel like under the right management could really blossom. Copy and paste that to Charlotte to some degree. That's what Zach Lowe was discussing not too long ago. And it feels like Woj acknowledges that too. And so does Jeff Peterson. He said it a million times. We want to make this a premier franchise. Okay, people can roll your eyes. I get it. That's the reputation that they've earned so far. But I still like shooting for the stars, and hopefully they can reach that. If we look down some of the other notes here, some of my other takeaways from Gabe Plotkin, Rick Schnall, and Jeff Peterson, not only on the introductory presser, but in some of the podcasts that Jeff Peterson joined afterwards. One thing that Jeff has been asked about a lot, I noticed this across every single platform, right? It's the injury luck or lack thereof with this Hornets team. I don't know how Jeff would answer this. This goes back to finding out answers or finding out some of the things that we can have answers to immediately rather than just go to, oh, yeah, we'll figure that out on the last 20 games that we have of this season. And then, everything will be an evaluation process. This falls in line of the latter. But it is interesting how everybody asked about what he can do to mitigate injuries. And Jeff told you some of these things you can limit, but sometimes it's just bad luck and there's nothing you can do. And so what he told you in these last 20 games, he's going to evaluate that and then figure it out, which ultimately means what is the training staff looking like? Do you want to get rid of those guys? Do you want to keep half and get rid of half? Whatever that means. But it's been pretty terrible for the Hornets. And I've never been one that's truly comfortable with criticizing the training staff because I wouldn't know how to criticize them. And it's hilarious. It's the classic I'm not a doctor thing, yet a lot of people will tell you, well, look, the training staff, they've not been having these guys healthy and ready to go, and so they need to be fired. I mean, I guess we can try to get as much evidence from player polls on how they view training staffs, and then if there's some reported terrible decision about letting a player play when he wasn't supposed to. We had a little bit of that, I guess, with the Hayward family, and then one instance is maybe enough to raise an eyebrow. I have not reached the point where I'm comfortable criticizing the training staff yet. You decide what you want to do. Jeff Peterson will have to have that same decision, and we'll see what he decides to do. But all I know is I'm tired of this house being haunted, as Doug likes to say, and I would really rather just be a healthy basketball team. That would be fantastic. Let's move on to the last segment of Locked On Hornets. We still have some more comments to comb through. And also, people asked questions on Twitter, tweeting at me, at Locked On Hornets, at Walker Mail, about some of the things that you guys wanted me to talk about. So, not a sicko satchel. Doug takes that with him when he leaves the pod. But we can get to some of these questions that people had for me, and I will get to them in the last segment. This episode is brought to you by Game Time. We always appreciate Game Time for their support. Thanks again for sponsoring us on this Jeff Peterson episode. Game Time is the only ticketing app that gives you complete peace of mind with your purchase, and you can see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. All-in prices show your total up front, so you know you're getting a great deal before you check out. You can buy tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. They're obsessed with finding ways to help you save money on those tickets, and they have deals on tickets right up to the start of the event and even an hour after it starts. It's the place to find last-minute seats. You can find exclusive flash deals and sponsored deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, but not just sporting events. Also concerts, comedy, theater, even more than that. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDON, locked on for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So I did want to get to some more comments real quickly, just as to what Jeff was mentioning. Jeff Peterson talked about Miles Bridges a little bit. Kyle Bailey, Adrian Wojnarowski both asked Jeff about the upcoming contract, and it's an important one. You go to the Hornets payroll, that's the contract that stands out the most. Unrestricted free agent. He can decide wherever he wants to go, and if a team gives him an offer sheet, Hornets don't have the right to match. But Miles has to want to leave. And I'll tell you, after hearing Jeff discuss Miles with Kyle and Miles with Woj, feels like he's coming back, man, which I'm not surprised. But when Jeff is asked about the younger players on this team and what he thinks about them, he mentions Miles. It's not just Brandon Miller. It's not just LaMelo. He talks about how impressive Miles is too. And with Kyle, he discussed how Miles going out there on the court and playing a bunch of games and being one of the healthier guys, at least. Look, he didn't play last year because it was a felony domestic violence arrest. It wasn't because he got injured. So I guess Jeff is right in that regard. Jeff also talked about character being a really important factor in what guys you're going to bring in. After that, when talking about Miles, Jeff said, I'm going to get to know him and see what he's about, but he likes him as a player, and I can understand it. Is he worth 20 to 25 million? Jeff will have to figure that one out, as well as what his opinion is on Miles' character. But I think he's coming back. That's not changed. It just feels more and more so like Jeff wants Miles back as well. And if he really is the chief basketball decision maker, then I expect Miles to come back as well. And then hopefully some of these practice facilities help Jeff Peterson and the Hornets out in general with attracting some of these free agents. Gabe Plotkin said that at the introductory presser. He said, with these upgraded facilities, yeah, you're hoping that you can give the players everything that they would be looking for from a high-class professional franchise. And if you start to upgrade some of those facilities, then yeah, it probably will bring you and help you bring in more talent. The last rapid-fire moments I wanted to bring up, Jeff Peterson talks about how alignment is huge from the owner to him as an executive vice president of basketball ops to the head coach. Having alignment is really important, and I can understand that. Like, if we wanted to focus on what his experience was with Brooklyn, whew, buddy, lots of drama over there. And he's credited in helping recruit Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, but there was some drama there too. Kevin Durant wanted the coach fired. Kyrie Irving wouldn't get the vax, and he's, saging TD Garden, which is probably one of the, finer things that he did. But yeah, there was a lot to deal with to where eventually you had to trade Kyrie Irving and then trade Kevin Durant and make the best out of that situation. It's easy to trade that kind of talent and get a good package in return, but Jeff was the guy that apparently made all that tenable, and I like that. If you have that type of power to manage the crises, as Woj put it, within Brooklyn, then I hope you don't have to deal with that level of crises here in Charlotte. And if you're able to do that, then I would think you can handle it here with the Hornets organization. So Jeff Peterson being able to do that, and also with the cap, making it to where smaller markets close the gap with some of the bigger markets and attracting free agents. Jeff Peterson made sure to note that too. He said not many guys even get to free agency with the new salary cap rules. And so it really helps if you draft well, which that's always been the case. But even especially here, if you can draft some talent, then odds are with the new cap that you'll be able to keep a lot of these guys. And you at least get to make that decision whether you want to keep them or not. So those are some of the things that Jeff Peterson had to say at his presser and also on some of these podcasts. Let's read some questions real quickly before we end today. Russell Daniel asked, should the Hornets draft the center since we have no idea about the future for Mark? Yeah, it's a good question. I think with this draft being so up in the air, I think you just draft best player available. Yeah, it's a simple thing to say, but especially with this draft being considered weak, not all the time is that going to be true. Like I remember the Kyrie Irving draft being considered weak, and there was some real talent that came out of that draft. So, it's not always true. But yeah, man, if the best player is a center and like there's a decent gap between whoever that center is and whoever is next on the list, especially if they have some shooting prowess, yeah, I mean, why wouldn't you draft that player? If you have a different position in the same tier, you probably go with that different position. But no, you take the most talented player, even if that does mean he's a center. Now, this is awkward. Here I am talking about Mark, who I legitimately very much like. Mark Muse on Twitter asked, how would you guys feel about taking Dalton Knecht in the draft? Watching him last night, he can really score and seems like a great second option. Look, as far as the draft goes, haven't done a lot of homework, so I know Dalton is an absolute star watching college basketball as far as how he fits in the NBA. Haven't done enough evaluation on that yet, but Dalton does look like a star. Would love to see him. Here's a funny one from Captain Regulator on Twitter. On the Woj Pod interview with Jeff Peterson, Woj mentioned how important Lonzo Ball, yes, that was correct, Lonzo Ball was for the Hornets. Which is worse, Woj believing Lonzo plays for the Hornets or Jeff Peterson not correcting him? I think it's worse for Woj. Because Jeff is just trying to focus on the question, and maybe he understands what he means anyway. But I'm going to go with Woj. Either way, probably not great. Out of Hornets, he writes in on Twitter, what areas of improvement do you think Jeff will target first? Training staff, coaching, players, or front office? Good question from Out of Hornets. I think it goes front office, the staffing there, and then I think it goes players. I think Steve Clifford is coming back. That's probably one of the more important things to talk about. Man, he likes himself some Steve. Like you heard it at the presser. He seems to genuinely enjoy Steve Clifford's company. And you heard it on some of these podcasts, how much he likes Steve. He joked about how he just thought Steve was this curmudgeon, constantly frowning, and this angry dude. And of course, it couldn't be further from the truth. If you know Steve or have had any one-on-one interaction, get to see him joke around, he's a great guy. Great guy. And I think especially if Steve and Jeff both have built a very good reputation within the league because of relationship building, then it's only natural for both of those guys to have a good relationship with one another. If that's the case, and you talk about having alignment all the way from the top to the bottom, you could still have that if you look for a new coach, but it's also already here. If Jeff and Steve get along, they already worked together in Brooklyn, then it would make sense that you keep Steve Clifford. So coaching, I think, is probably last. You have to have the draft. You have to make sure what your front office is. The training staff, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, he'll figure out that stuff too. And so what areas of improvement do you think he'll target first? If he makes changes, training staff and front office. But if you don't have any changes, then training staff will, I just think the likelihood of that changing is 50-50. I'm not exactly sure. You have to hit the draft. You have to make sure you have the right staffing because that's important to Jeff Peterson. And then I do think Steve Clifford's coming back. So I guess if you think he's coming back, they'll probably make that decision pretty quickly. That'll do it today for Locked On Hornets. Thanks for making us your first listen. We're free and available anywhere you get your pods, and that includes YouTube. Have a great rest of your day. I'll be back with you tomorrow to give you another solo episode. And then Doug, I believe, will join me on Monday. I believe that's the case. So I'll be back with you tomorrow to give you more Peterson analysis and also look at the upcoming schedule here for the Charlotte Hornets. This has been Locked On Hornets on the Locked On Podcast Network.